In the late 1700s, early settlers to Kentucky had to fight for their survival. They wanted land of their own on the frontier. They came from the east to claim the land and build up settlements out of the wilderness. Life was hard and dangerous. For many, their best hope for survival was in a fort. Kentucky's first settlement fort was Fort Harrod. It was built like other forts, designed to protect and defend the people inside in times of danger. Thick log doors and walls formed a rectangle with an inner courtyard. Inside was a miniature city with cabins, a blacksmith shop, and the basics for surviving on the frontier. From the second story of the corner blockhouses, guns poked through to fight off attacks from the British and Native Americans. In 1763, the British promised the Native Americans they would reserve the land west of the Allegheny Mountains for them, and that no one else could settle there. Many groups of native people were familiar with the land we now know as Kentucky. They had a claim to the land, and they didn't want other people taking it. But still, people were pushing west. Fur traders and explorers said Kentucky was a land with everything necessary for pioneer life. Thick trees, rich soil, and abundant wildlife. James Harrod and Daniel Boone were among several men who were eager to establish settlements in Kentucky. Harrod and his men came mostly by water, down the Ohio and Kentucky rivers. Explorer Daniel Boone came by land, following a trail made by buffalo and Native Americans, through the Cumberland Gap, up the Wilderness Trail. As the Wilderness Trail widened, more and more people followed Daniel Boone's route into Kentucky. These forts and smaller structures, called stations, were the beginning of today's Kentucky towns. At first, settlers slept on straw beds, on dirt floors with very few extras. They had only what they could bring on horseback or make themselves. Over time, cabins had wood floors, cooking pots, simple furniture, tools, and pole beds.
Hello, I'm the woodworker here, and my job is very important here. A lot of the things I do would be involved in making furniture, different types of tools like plows and things, handles for tools. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to work on making a leg for a stool. And what I'm using today, the bench I'm sitting on here, is known as a shave horse. And it is a simple foot vise used to clamp the wood, which then frees your hands up to use this type of knife. Is called a draw knife, a two-handled knife, which is used just simply to plane wood. As you pull it towards you, you can see it shaves the wood, which is known as planing. And you can whittle, basically, different types of wood and make furniture legs and different things like that. Different types of woods were chosen for their qualities. Wood like hickory may be chosen for its strength, for handles. Wood like black walnut would be chosen more for its beauty, for use in furniture and things like that. As you can see, this is actually a very effective whittling tool. You can actually do things very, very quickly. It cuts very smooth in the surface. So it's really, after one is whittled a piece of furniture or something, not much more work is needed to be done on this.
Using tools and resources effectively was important to survival. Even fat from meat, called tallow, was used for making soap and candles.
This is where I make hand-dipped candles. I dip in a big kettle. Usually we would do this outside, made of tallow, which is animal fat, and we would dip in a big kettle over a fire and then into a bucket of water to quick set it. Sometimes we use candle molds. The molds are quicker and easier, but they do tend to trap air bubbles in them, so you get a little bit better quality candle by hand dipping. Candles were mostly used for church or funerals or weddings, not in the home so much. In the house, they would use grease lamps, rush lights, candle wood, and even pine knots as light.
It was impossible to bring everything on horseback, so settlers made a lot of things from scratch.
I'm making a basket. I have to, because I don't have anything to store my things in. Baskets are a wonderful way of storing things, and my children and I, we make them when we have time. We do many things here in the fort, but we also have to have baskets for storage and doing things. We have many different types of woods we use, so as we're weaving the basket, my children are learning also how to go over and under in order to make the basket tight and strong. And so with wood, we use oak, we use ash. Of course, my husband's out cutting the ash, and then he brings it to us, and then we have to pound it or throw it off of the wood. Then it's broke apart at the growth rings. Now my children like to sit and split those growth rings apart to make this part called a stave. Now with the weaver, we go over and under, and that way it's going to be strong and tight. So we go all the way around, and then we just keep doing this until the basket is completely made to the size that we need.
Early settlers had to be on guard in case of an attack. Traveling in groups and working together helped the early settlers claim the land. Frontier life was dangerous. The first settlers were breaking a British treaty to leave the land as Indian Reserve. In an attack, the second story of the corner blockhouses provided good locations for keeping watch and shooting. Fort Harrod was built around a spring and close to another, which provided water when the fort was under attack. Having enough water to outlast an attack was important. Fort Boonesborough was close to the Kentucky River, but getting to the river was sometimes impossible while under siege. They had to rely on stored water in an attack. Guns weren't the only weapons of choice. Gunpowder was too expensive to use all the time. Axes were used as weapons, as well as tools. Pioneers adopted the small axe, called the tomahawk, from the Indians, which could be used both to cut down small trees or as a weapon. Early settlers practiced their skills in case of attack. If an axe blade or other iron tool broke, the blacksmith could make the necessary repairs.
I'm the blacksmith here at the fort. Blacksmiths on the frontier were very important because anything iron that had to be manufactured or happened to break would be made or repaired here. Right now I'm working on a Flint Striker for making fire. I will use my bellows to pump air into the forge, which will in turn heat the coal, which will heat my steel. When I get it to the proper temperature, I'll move to my anvil, where I will use my hammers and other shaping tools to form it into proper shape for whatever it happens to be that I'm making at the time.
The bellows is used to pump air into the fire to make it even hotter. Creating a finished piece requires heating, molding, bending, and hammering. The blacksmith was essential to an early settlement for repairing and making necessary items of iron. Flint strikers were used in starting fires. Being able to start a fire was important for everyday life.
Starting a fire right here with flint and steel, in order to do that, you need a flint striker about like this. It's made out of a very hard piece of steel. Here I've got my flint, which is used to hit the striker with. This is some charred cloth right here. It's used to catch a spark from the flint and the steel when they're hit together. When you strike a piece of flint and steel together, you get sparks. Now this is already burning. And what I'm going to do is put this in my tinder here, which is just some cedar bark that I've got. There you have a fire.
Fire was necessary for cooking and tasks like making candles. Inside the forts, places for fire were shared. Sharing resources and working together helped the early settlers survive. Most settlers didn't often use money. They bartered. Bartering, or trading one item for another, was one way early settlers got what they needed. In trading an animal skin for a tomahawk, both people get something they need, or can at least trade or barter for something else. The Transylvania store at Fort Boonesborough had many essentials for the settlers. Some settlers specialized in jobs and traded items they made, such as pottery.
Hi, I'm the potter here at the fort, and I've got an important job to do. I make all the mugs, the bowls, the plates, just anything to eat or drink out of here at the fort. But that's not all. I also make jugs to store liquid in. I make inkwells to store ink so people can write. But most importantly, I make lidded jars. Now, in order to store vegetables and food for the winter here, they need to can the food in these lidded jars, then wax the lid shut to preserve them. Now, everything I make here starts out just like this, just a lump of clay here on the potter's wheel. But clay's not easy to get. It comes right from the ground. And here in Kentucky, we've got really good sources. So I have to go to the riverbanks, dig all the clay up, but it's not clean or ready to use yet. So the first thing I'll do is I'll soak it in water and let all the leaves and sticks and organic material float to the top. Then I'll skim that off and press the rest through a sieve. Now what that does is it gets all the rocks and the pebbles and things like that out of it. And then I have to re-dry it back to a state where I can work with it, dig a hole in the ground, store it in the ground, and then put a damp cloth over it to keep it from getting dry. I'll probably spend more time digging and preparing my clay than I will making pots. Now what I'm making right now is just a bowl that any settler could use to eat out of or to serve something with. Now this clay is soft right now, and that makes it where I can make the bowl, but I'm going to have to let it set up and dry overnight, and then I can clean up the bottom and finish it out. But it's going to take about 2 weeks for it to dry, just sitting out in the air. Then I'm going to put it in a kiln, and what we have is a groundhog kiln. Now a groundhog kiln is dug into the side of a hill, lined with clay brick, which I fired in a bonfire, and then fired with wood. It'll have a chimney in the back, and the draft of the air will help heat the kiln. Native Americans made pottery in the area also, but they didn't have the technology that the settlers here did. So I came over from Europe, so I've got all the European technology, but the Native Americans here did all their pottery hand-built, and instead of kilns, they had just bonfires that they fired them in.
The ways of Native Americans influenced the settlers at the fort in their garden. Native Americans planted corn, beans, and squash, and called them the Three Sisters for the way they grew well together. As more and more people came, hunting became even more difficult. People depended on their gardens for food, especially the corn.
Well, this is our hominy block, and this is where we smash our corn into cornmeal. And once the corn is smashed, we'll take the cornmeal and make our Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes just being a little fried cornbread. And once we get all that prepared, then I'll do it for my supper.
Early settlers also grew flax to make linen. Linen and wool were spun into thread on the spinning wheel.
I'm spinning some wool, and this is what they would have made their clothes out of back then. Even the children, 5 and 6 years old, could have started on this wheel, and they would have done their share of the spinning. They would fill the spool, and then they would take the spool, put it on the take-up reel, and then they would take it to the person that was going to do their weaving, and that person could tell by the number of skeins that they could make so many yards of clothing. They made all their clothing from wool or from linen. And mostly the adults would make the linen because it's so much more fragile. But the children had no trouble doing this.
This is a barn loom, typical of an 18th century loom. Now, the first thing that had to be done back then was the women and children as young as 5 and 6 had to spin flax fibers, hemp fibers, buffalo hair, sheep's wool in order to make the thread. The weaver would then take the thread and put it on the loom. First he puts it on the warp reel to measure what's needed and then threads the warp. We have 864 threads on here. It took a week to thread and it'll make 25 yards of cloth. Now you'll see that making cloth is very time consuming. First thing we do, we have 2 groups of threads on here that are controlled by the pedals that raise and lower the threads. That opens the shed. This is the shuttle that takes the weft or wolf thread through the shed. The beater will pack it together. You bring up the other group of threads and pack that, and then you go back. It's back and forth, 1 thread at a time. Lindsey Woolsey is what the average citizen would have worn, combination of linen and wool. Linen gave it strength, wool gave it warmth. And linen comes from the flax plant. The settlers brought the seeds out here with them. That ripens in June. They pull it up by the root to get as much length as possible, and then they have to work the fibers out.
Children were expected to help on the frontier and did chores, such as drawing water from the spring at Fort Harrod. The fortunate ones had school.
Good morning, class.
Good morning.
Fort Harrod had the first school west of the Allegheny Mountains. Miss Jane Coombs was the first teacher.
All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought it was all in fun. Pop goes the weasel. Very good. Now, for those of you who have your horn books, I want you to take them out. You on the first row. And
the school was called a blab school because the children sang or blabbed to learn their alphabet or math facts. Wooden paddles called horn books were used. The children sat on crude wooden benches with a dirt floor. The teacher said the holes between the logs in the schoolhouse gave the children fresh air, even in cold weather. Frontier life wasn't easy, but there were many changes in a short time. Little time passed from 1774 to 1792 when Kentucky became a state, but so much happened. The early settlers at the forts cooperated in their fight for survival. Everyone worked together in the fight to survive attacks. The early fort residents also had to fight to meet their basic needs for water, food, clothing, and shelter. Over time, most improved their living conditions by mastering specific skills and using the resources of the land. At first, settlers claimed their land, using an axe to clear the trees and build a cabin. At night and in dangerous times, they would return to the safety of the fort. Eventually, the settlers lived in their own cabins with conveniences and tools of the time. In less than 20 years from the settlement of these early forts, Kentucky became a state. The early settlers led others to Kentucky by their example. Soon their pathways and traditions were followed by more people who wanted to call Kentucky home.